Oil. It has become as much a part of survival in our world as having water. And many don't realize just how dependent we are on this product from deep underground. Items we use daily, like lipstick, sunglasses, luggage, and DVDs, to solvents, motor oil, and gasoline, all are created from petroleum. To corporate giants like Kinder Morgan, the choice is clear. Pipelines are needed in order to preserve our energy supply, our economy, and for national security. They believe pipelines are necessary. For those on the front lines, the landowners, pipelines have become an issue of eminent domain and pollution. The unanswered question is, at what cost?
I remember having the chickens and the hogs and the cows and helping my dad pick up the eggs, and he actually had a little egg grater thing that was, the eggs would drop down, and it would separate the sizes. And he sold eggs in Savannah. He sold produce in Savannah. Because they don't understand all the blood, sweat, and tears that's been put in it. Sure don't.
When I was a young man, we always had family dinners and family reunions, and we had them at my grandmother's house, which is about a quarter of a mile up the road. And the whole family got together, and of course we farmed the land. I didn't personally farm it, but my uncles and all farmed the land. We cut timber on the land. We managed the land. My grandfather, we would burn plots every year, control burn, to keep the land up. And really, to me, this land is, when a lightning strikes a tree here, it almost feels like it takes one of the family members away to me, because this stuff's been in my family. I raised my child here. We were able to hunt and fish on this land and do the things that we wanted to do on the land. You know, prior to companies coming in and trying to upset your way of life. I got a lot of good memories here, and like I said, every time another company comes along and tries to carve out another little swath of land that they want to take, they just take part of you away.
One of the things that's so memorable to me when I think about this land is it has brought so many memories and good memories to my family. My mother was widowed when she was 63, and she lived there on this land, and she did not move. She would call the view from her bedroom window her $1 million view. And every afternoon, she would go for a walk across the top of one of the fields, and the sun would be just beginning to set, and she would just talk about how nothing could compare to being able to walk through those fields.
What this issue is to me is it's this thing called eminent domain. For regardless of whether you've had the property as long as I have had, my family has had it, or regardless of whether it has just been an acquisition that you've made in the last few years, it's part of you. You worked hard for it. It's America. It's ownership. We can own land in America, and when you own something, you feel that that it's yours, and you can do what you want to with it. And to have a private, for-profit entity to come in and basically offer you a price that you know you've got to take because they have the eminent domain card that they can play on you at any particular point in time. It's almost like it's against motherhood, apple pie, and the flag in a way. It's against what we all think of this business of ownership should be. And I go back to the point that you can have an acre, you can have a half acre, you can have anything. When somebody wants to take what you have, it's almost thievery to a certain extent. It's a glorified way that somebody has concocted to get what you have.
It was my understanding that eminent domain meant a hospital, a road, but Kendall Morgan was for profit, and that I didn't understand. And I went through this with my great aunt as a child because they were putting a road through her 100-year-old scuppernong vine, and that's what killed her. But for profit, you're gonna tear down my whole woods and possibly contaminate everything else I've got so somebody can buy a tank of gas? Come on.
But this thing is being shoved down the throats of private landowners of the state so as to benefit the pipeline people and the big oil companies.
It's like putting a scar on you. They're going to put the scar on the land, but it feels like abuse, like they're going to cut you because it's your land, and there's no need, especially when we have granted easements, we have granted right-of-ways, but they've always been for a utility, a public use, or something like that.
When people talk about extending the right of eminent domain to a gasoline pipeline company, we need to keep the perspective. The perspective is that in the United States, first, there's an extremely important constitutional right of owning property. When eminent domain is extended to a private entity, that is a huge hole, a huge denigration of that constitutional right. So the other part of the perspective is to keep in mind that gasoline pipeline companies are for-profit companies. Profit is fine, but for-profit companies are not the same as the highway department needing to construct a new road in a particular place for the immediate need of the public. These are private companies, and if they want land from people, they should be required, like you and I, if we want to buy our neighbor's land, to go to that neighbor and negotiate a price. But the neighbor has the right to say, no, my family has owned this land for generations. I don't want to sell it. I want my grandkids to be here. All of those rights, all of that discussion is off the table when eminent domain is extended, because then the landowner has no right to say no. The entity can take it without his permission.
From state to state, there are variations in the wording, but in most cases, eminent domain is defined as the power of the government to take private property and convert it into public use. And there is a long history of this in our country. In 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt enacted the Tennessee Valley Authority Act, which essentially had Congress create a corporation clothed with the power of government but possessed of the flexibility and initiative of a private enterprise. The whole mission was to help lift the nation out of the deep darkness that was the Great Depression. The vision of modernizing the Tennessee Valley region was no small task, but a series of dams generating electricity and education of the local residents on the use of fertilizers and other means made a huge difference. In all, over 15,000 families were displaced. In 1956, President Dwight D. Eisenhower championed the Federal Aid Highway Act. Eisenhower had seen how pitiful our transportation network was in 1919 with the U.S. Army's first transcontinental motor convoy. It was a matter of national security to be able to transport troops and weaponry from one part of the nation to another efficiently. This act made it happen. In the process, many miles of land were taken from private owners, but again, it was for the good of the country, not strictly a private entity. Today, eminent domain has become something that can be, and is, used by the private sector. Cases such as Kelo versus New London, Connecticut, where private property was taken for economic development and supported by a 5-4 vote in the Supreme Court, have occurred. But there have been victories. For instance, in Kentucky, it was ruled that the Bluegrass Pipeline, a pipeline that would have carried natural gas liquids through Kentucky from fracking zones in Ohio and Pennsylvania, was not legal because, as the 3 judges unanimously put, if these natural gas lines are not reaching Kentucky consumers, then Bluegrass and its pipeline cannot be said to be in the public service of Kentucky. Finally, it was determined that the companies involved will have to deal with landowners on a willing seller, willing buyer basis. Condemnation will not be permitted.
So when eminent domain enters the judicial system, when there's an action where the landowners are being sued, there are 2 main issues that can come up. First is the question in some cases whether the eminent domain action is lawful at all. Does the entity in fact hold the power of eminent domain, and is it using it legitimately for the purpose for which it holds it? So in many cases, but not all, that's an important issue. In many cases, that isn't an issue, and that it's going to be abundantly clear that the purpose stated by the condemning entity, whether it's to build a school, build a road, or a utility building a power line, it may be completely clear that there is a legal right to do that, and therefore, in those cases, the landowner can't object to that. All the landowner essentially is left with is the second major issue. That is, what is the fair price? What is, in the words of the U.S. Constitution, just compensation? What is compensation enough that the court will say it happens to be just?
If we get to this point and we start allowing private companies to prove a necessity or a need for their product, and they're able to utilize eminent domain to further their business, where does it stop? Currently, this is limited to energy companies, but once you open that can of worms, who's not to say that other people don't come along and say, hey, if it's good for them, it's got to be good for us. And once you get it into courts, who knows how it's going to go.
A private company should have to negotiate with the landowners to get what they want. And I own a private company myself, and I can't just go and condemn people's land because I want to put a manufacturing plant there. I have to buy it or come to fair market value terms. Not the government don't step in and say what the fair market value is, and there's other reasons that every conversation I've had with them has not went well, and they came back and asked me if they could survey again. I told them no, and they went and done it anyway and left markers all the way through my field. So they have no respect, regardless of what they say for these people they buy out on TV. They really have no respect for the landowner.
We're coming to take your land, but we're not going to tell you where the maps are. We want to show, and it's a necessity, You guys need this, but we're not going to tell you who we're selling to. We're not going to tell you how long we're selling to us. Just believe us. It's okay. We know what's best for you.
The Kinder Morgan people, when we really talked to them, several of us family members after a meeting, we determined that we were going to end up being liable a good bit of the time. And we're going to have timber that is landlocked between the pipeline and the river because they've chosen to go parallel. We, of course, can't take our timber into the river or over the river because there's no bridge. So we have no choice but to cross over the pipeline every time we need to go in and out of our property, whether it's just to go fishing or hunting, whether it's just to go sightseeing or bird watching, or whether we need to take in equipment to plow fire breaks or to harvest our timber and loaded log trucks. And there's going to be conditions that Kinder Morgan has for us. We are going to have a pipeline operator come down 48 hours in advance, call them. They will test the pipe and see if there's been any washing. They'll tell us if we need to add extra dirt, if we need to do special matting to get our trucks in and out. And so, but we as landowners have to pay for all of that. And so that's money that comes out of our timber income. But they indicated that if we don't do that right, or even if we do what the pipeline operator says, they can still hold us liable because we have potentially ruptured their pipeline, which they forced us to put on our property.
Probably the primary concern that Patty and I have is the potential loss of the value of the land. Under the eminent domain process, Kinder Morgan would give us what they consider fair market value. Our concern is if you look at the actual pipeline itself, the right-of-way is 50 feet wide. In our land, they would actually traverse through about 1,500 feet of land, and if you do the math, that's about 2 acres. Land values in this area range from $8,000 to $10,000 per acre. So if in their mind fair market value is 2 acres at $8,000 to $10,000 an acre, that's $16,000 to $20,000 one-time payment we'd receive, and that's it. They would basically have it in, forever. And our position is in 5 to 10 years down the road, we would very likely want to downside and sell. And research that we've done shows that virgin land such as this, with no other right-of-ways or impacts, you have anywhere from a 10 to a 50% reduction in value of the land, and that would be significantly more of a financial impact than the $16,000 to $20,000 one-time payment we would get. So our concern would be that we'd get very small compensation for a potentially, devastating financial loss.
The whole issue is the land. It's the land. I don't care about the money. I want the land. I don't want more people on me. Now this is going to be a 4th subcontracting group I've got to deal with, and their track record is the worst. They're the biggest with the most money, worst track record, and that does not, and look, past experience is what you've seen, what's happened, and I hadn't even seen them, and look where we are. Not good.
Throughout the very beginning of this 7 meetings now process, they have told us from day one, and they have told the landowners, we have the best detection system. We have these little things inside that know as soon as it spills, it's 4 feet underground, so they have to be really good. We fly over your property every 7 to 14 days, which, by the way, I find terrifying. I don't want somebody surveying my property every 14 days. I'll thank you to stay away. But they're going to know. They're going to know they're going to be there, and oh, by the way, the person who's in Atlanta that's monitoring it will be able to flip the switch 200 and something miles away. You'll be fine, right? So they're standing there telling us this. We knew there was a spill in early December in Belton, South Carolina. We knew it was 8,000 gallons, but it wasn't really clear. Everything hadn't come out in the wash quite yet. So we know, and of course Kinder Morgan knows, because they've got trucks going every single day. They've got wells in the ground pumping all this stuff out. They're taking soil out of the ground. They're taking diesel out of the groundwater. No doubt that this spill was very much bigger than they first reported, right? And at the same time, standing there, bold-faced telling us, it's fine, we know when this stuff leaks. Well, about 2 weeks ago, the truth came out. It wasn't an 8,000 gallon spill, it was an 8,000 barrel spill. Slight difference. They didn't detect the leak. The landowner noticed that his grass was dying and he smelled diesel fuel. That's how the leak was detected. It wasn't detected immediately. It was detected maybe 2 months after it started, a month after it started. We don't have any clear answers.
They're going to have this pipeline very close to the Savannah River. Some of our land is close as a half a mile, and some of our family land may be about two miles away. But it's all in what you call the watershed of the Savannah River. So you see, you see streams, you see cypress bogs. It's wet. We went to our property yesterday, and that was the first time we'd been able to drive down in there in 11 days because we had not had a rain in 11 days. So you have to access your property, oftentimes you have to wait till it's a little bit drier. Yet they want to put a pipeline through the middle of this. And, if you have any kind of slow leak or any kind of problem, it might be months before it's ever detected because there are not, it's like a nature preserve down there. There's just hundreds and hundreds of acres. Unless it's accidentally discovered by a forester or, looking at someone's timber down there, or a hunter during hunting season, or some of us landowners that do cruise our property. The spill could go on for months and months, and once it gets anywhere in any of the water, that water will eventually make its way to the Savannah River.
Traditionally, people think of swamps or wetlands as cheaper land because you cannot build on it. It always has wet. So the land value tends to be cheaper. So when you look at a proposed project like this, well, they're going to focus in on those wetlands because that's the cheaper land to take from somebody. Well, the problem is that those wetlands serve as our kidneys and our liver systems of the river. And so they're talking about putting trenches through, and then I would assume that you'll be able to drive over. I'm sure you're going to need to drive over this pipeline. Well, that cuts the whole wetland off. It works in a sheet flow, right? That's how it cleans. When you do that, you've cut the whole thing in the middle. So that's a huge, huge issue for us. We use this river industrially a lot, and we need that assimilative capacity. We need those wetlands to keep it clean because not only our drinking water, but our economic drivers are based on this river.
Every time we put in another pipeline, every time another industry starts pouring in wastewater, every single one of these is a cut. And death by 1,000 cuts is still death. These are something that are a national treasure, these marshlands and these rivers. So even if it's not in your backyard, even if it's somewhere where you're not going to see it, sooner or later you or your loved ones will come down here and appreciate this land. And we want it to remain that way for many generations to come.
Wetland areas are very important for not only habitat for our wildlife, which is important for the entire ecosystem. But wetlands also hold that flood water, and contain it when necessary, and then also filter the water when necessary as it's moving down into the ground to recharge our aquifers. And here on the coast of Georgia, we rely predominantly on the Floridan aquifer for our drinking water. And if we mess that up somehow, then we're in a world of trouble. So it's a lot bigger issue than just constructing a pipeline. And I feel like people need to realize all of those impacts, whether it be a private property owner or a canoeist going down the river, exploring the wetland, or just someone who's filling up their tank of gas and realizing, how it's impacting your area.
So it's not just crossing the river, it's crossing acres and acres, probably hundreds of acres of wetlands. It's not just the river, it's the areas that drain into the river. It's the areas that are adjacent to the river. It's the hardwood forests that are the floodplain for the river that these, utility lines and things like that are trying to cut through. And so that's what we're concerned about, is that, it's like you said, death by 1,000 cuts. If it's not one thing, it's another, and it keeps building. There's more and more projects coming online, and each of these really needs to have the river in mind, and the river as its and the environment as one of its main concerns.
Within these river watersheds that could be affected, there is also a thriving ecosystem of plants and animals. In fact, 4 of the land tracts that Kinder Morgan is requesting will go through heritage preserves, where both federal and state-protected wildlife reside.
I think that Kinder Morgan's proposal is obscene. I feel very badly when I think about the impact that it could have on the river with the fish. As it comes through the wetlands on both sides of the river, Georgia, South Carolina is going to be impacting endangered plants and animals, and they already are impacted by development and so forth. And it's a very sad situation that a company can do something like that, and so many people are unaware of what's involved in this. So I'm very concerned about it.
The most whole thing that you could have would be a large tract of wild land, unbroken. And anything that breaks up that land, be it a road, a power line, a pipeline, a path, affect negatively the abundance and persistence of wild species. The science is called conservation biology. And that science shows you that even a footpath placed through a wild wood will negatively affect wild species there. Will their numbers begin to plummet? They have to travel farther and farther to find their kind, to mate, they have to travel farther and farther, they have to work harder to find food. And that's the same thing that we're seeing in society, that as we divide and subdivide and pave nature, that we become more and more divided from each other. And so we know wholeness then, we know possibility, we know hope to be located in wild tracts of wild land. That's what's so dangerous about a pipeline. It comes through and it divides wild community, which also divides human community. It divides us from our neighbors. It divides us from our ideologies. It divides us from our histories. It divides us from our love of place.
In the Appalachian Mountains area, we have rock, and that is less permeable and water doesn't absorb into that as easy. We're out on the coastal plain, in a lot of places in the country, we have layers of sediment, and that's usually either sand layers or clay layers. So water will easily infiltrate through the sand layers, but as soon as it hits a layer of clay-rich material, it's impeded and it'll tend to flow laterally. Some will still go down slowly, so it all depends on how much clay you have below you. If you go into the Great Plains, where they talk about the Ogallala Aquifer, the problem there is it's a very sandy, rich surface, and the aquifer is right there, and there's nothing to protect it. Where we're at here, yes, we have lots of sand at the surface, but there's also layers of clay, and it doesn't take much clay in the subsurface to block the water that would make its way down 300-400 feet to our Floridan aquifer. But there are still avenues, so it all depends on how thick a sequence you have and where you're drawing your water from. If you're drawing water from the surface, these contaminants can easily get into a superficial aquifer. But a deep aquifer like ours, it's much more difficult, but it still can get there. And once it's there, they're almost impossible to clean up.
Once this gasoline or whatever goes into the ground, it's going to hit the water table. The water table is where we have saturated conditions. Okay, so it hits the water table and then it sits on the water table. I'm going to introduce a term, light non-aqueous phase liquid. And so I'll use the acronym, an LNAPL. So let's say we've got a problem, a petroleum release, the LNAPL. We've pumped out the LNAPL, but really this is just the beginning of the problem. Because although the LNAPL, in this case the petroleum release, and water are not miscible, they don't mix very well, over time, and we're talking months, years, enough of the gasoline constituents dissolve into the groundwater and will travel with the groundwater. The EPA has promulgated limits for 4 constituents in gasoline. And those constituents are benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and methylbenzene, which most people know as xylenes. Okay? And the EPA has done enough risk investigation so that we have low limits. We have limits on what the concentrations of these things can be in groundwater. And for some of these constituents, especially ethylbenzene, ethylbenzene is usually the one that has the lowest limit. It's 5 ppb, 5 parts per billion, which is really very low, and it's something you or I wouldn't be able to taste. But the EPA has, through investigations, through risk assessments, toxicology, health assessments, found that anything over 5 parts per billion for ethylbenzene could be a risk to human health if there's an exposure scenario on a chronic basis.
Say a spill was to occur anywhere near here, South Augusta, their drinking water is less than a mile downstream. So you're really talking about an area where there's a decent amount of influx of drinking water systems. What's even scarier, because they're only crossing the Savannah River in one place, and they're going through these wetlands and this area in between Augusta and Savannah, is that there aren't municipal drinking water systems between here and Savannah, not a lot of them. People rely on wells. Farms rely on wells. It's not just somebody's drinking water, it's also the water you put on your crops, right? There's a huge agricultural area. The way that the water works from here down is it's very, very shallow. There's springs that come out all over the place. The average person's well is maybe 40 foot deep. So if a spill occurs, the water moves laterally underneath everything. You see it in the surface sometimes, and it's moving underneath the ground. So if we do have a spill, not only is the river at risk, but there's no telling how far that plume could get out and get into other people's drinking water.
There has to be attention given. That is, the pipeline itself must be rigorous enough. In addition to the walls of the pipe itself, all the joints, all the attachments to it must be secure, and there must be sufficient attention to maintenance and repair. Because again, When that pipe is underground and there's grass growing on the surface, it can be easy to ignore it. But you have to always know that there is a lot of high pressure product in that line that can be very dangerous to people and to the environment. And so it has to be kept in the pipe. Any escape from the pipe is hazardous.
My career has been with the University of Georgia Cooperative Extension Service, and I worked with farmers for about 30 years. Farmers that tilled the fields. I have seen equipment get bigger and larger and tillage implements that will go deeper and deeper as time goes on. One farmer can farm thousands of acres of land nowadays. He used to just farm just a small amount. And it's been because of mechanization. In my present career, I'm a forester. So I work with the land. I work with people that harvest their timber, and that's my job. And what I see commonly is log trucks and farm trucks having to cross pipelines. And it's not uncommon for us to discover that these pipelines are not buried as deep as they should be. I think they were buried properly to start off with, but things happen. You have erosion, and you have various factors that pretty well expose these pipelines. And in many cases, it might have been buried 4 foot deep, but we find out due to erosion and various environmental factors, it's only 2 foot deep. So it becomes a danger. And it just brings up the idea to me is, you know, after these things are down 20 years, or if they're down 30 years, or if they're down 40 years, or 50 years, or whatever and all, we're going to have the potential for lots of accidents to occur on these farms and in this forestry environment that we're in, with log trucks and farm trucks and large tillage equipment that we're developing now by the agricultural interest.
The questions that one has to ask are, how long will a pipe filled with highly pressurized hazardous liquid or gas last before it leaks? Once the digging is done and the pipe is buried in the earth, do you and your descendants now have land that could be severely polluted thanks to a leak in the future? The answers we do have are not comforting. The Department of Transportation estimates that over 2 million barrels of hazardous liquid has been released into the environment by pipelines over the past 20 years. 7.9% of incidents were due to incorrect operation. 18.1% were due to corrosion, and over 30% were due to equipment failure. And if you look across the country at the different pipeline spills, there is no discriminating as to where they happen or when. Pipelines are generally regarded as a much safer way to transport fuel. When you imagine trucks, tankers, and freight trains, and the possibility of human error, this is very true. Based on statistics gathered from the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research, road incidents were the highest, followed by rail, then natural gas pipelines, and finally, in last place, hazardous liquid pipelines. But when there is a rupture or leak with a pipeline, the environmental factor could be much larger than with other methods of transportation. The Manhattan Institute continues with more data. The average amount of product released per year was highest with hazardous liquid pipelines, 13 times more than by road. Pipeline proponents would argue that the number is skewed, since so much more liquid is transported via pipelines than by rail or truck. True, and unlike trucks or trains, if pipelines are regularly maintained, their lifespan should be for long periods of time. But maintenance is something that Kinder Morgan has been fined for countless times during the past. And according to the Interstate Natural Gas Association of America, more than 60% of all active U.S. pipeline infrastructure was installed more than 4 decades ago. Aging pipeline infrastructure is more susceptible to failures such as external corrosion, rain, flood damage, excavation damage, manufacturing defects, component defects, weld defects, and stress corrosion cracking. There are other concerns about maintenance in regards to Kinder Morgan.
We have seen a filing last year of a shareholder derivative action in the state of Delaware against Kinder Morgan. And in that shareholders derivative action, it is alleged in the suit papers that Kinder Morgan has been pulling way too much in the way of profits from its operations and giving way too little attention for maintenance and repairs.
Where's the master plan in all this? Where are we headed with energy? Are we going to be using fossil fuels forever? At what point do we say, hey, we've got enough fossil fuels developed at this point in time? When are we going to come out with incentives for people to use solar power? When are we going to come out with incentives for companies to invest and explore the uses of these things? I think we see a pushback with the Keystone Pipeline, regardless of what side you come down on this issue. But I think that with the Google car coming out and other technologies like this, I think we can see the reduction in the use of fossil fuels and the genuine desire for people of this country to be able to use an electric car or use some type of energy other than a fossil fuel and not be so dependent upon other people and the politics of the world. We're playing right into the hands of the politics of the world with this pipeline and with doing other things of that nature.
What we are seeing in Georgia is something called utility scale solar is really taking off. So this is these large solar arrays, often in more rural parts of the state, being built sometimes in the middle of a pine plantation, sometimes in the middle of a cotton field. So likely in a lot of the places that they're talking about putting these pipelines through, people are building huge solar arrays and powering hundreds of homes. There are also some really exciting, very recent developments that we're seeing in cities. So the city of Atlanta just 2 weeks ago came out with an announcement. They're going to put solar on 28 of their firehouses, police stations, rec centers. The city of Athens is launching something called Solarize Athens, which is where neighbors get together. So hundreds of neighbors get together and bulk purchase basically solar service so that you can get a really good deal on putting solar on your roof. So we're seeing 100 different ways that solar is really taking off in Georgia.
We obviously have a fossil fuel based economy. It's an economic system that we've had since the Industrial Revolution. That's why we have all the things that we have. And it's used for more than just fueling our vehicles. It's that's where our fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides. It's how we pump water that irrigates our crops. I mean, it's truly the lifeblood of a modern economy. The problem, of course, is there's a consequence of this. One of the discharges from this process is CO2 and other types of greenhouse gases, and it's changing the climate. And so ultimately we are going to have to move towards renewable and non-carbon type fuels if we ever hope to have a habitable planet for our grandchildren. So the question I always ask people is, do we want to should we continue investing in expanding our fossil fuel infrastructure, which is a dead-end road for us? Eventually we won't have a habitable planet, or should we change course and start investing in expanding our infrastructure in renewables and non-carbon? And to me, we obviously can't drop our fossil fuels, we're still going to need to continue to, that's what our economy is based on. We still have to use those resources. But expanding that and not taking the path of green energy, I think, is very short-sighted.
Transport product from one place to another to serve customers. Customers then deliver that product to homes and businesses. So we're in the transportation business, and we transport based upon what our customers tell us that they need. We don't build pipelines and hope that someday people might use them. We build them based upon customer needs. So we're not just talking about the need today or tomorrow or 2 weeks from now. We're trying to forecast with our customers over 20, 25, 30 years and determine what the needs for the state of Georgia based upon the 40+% population growth that's anticipated in the region, the 23 counties that we're talking about, the increase in need for refined products that's taken into account, better mileage in cars, probably less consumption in some parts of the industry, but overall, taking a full analysis, that additional product will be needed in the amounts that we're talking about. This is all domestic product from the Gulf to Georgia, South Carolina, and Florida. 100% domestic. No export as part of the project. It's all destined for shipment to terminals in the areas that I mentioned.
Having an energy crisis, I could see looking for stuff, oil and the way to transport and the way to get it from a national perspective. But we were the largest exporter of fossil fuels last year, the #1. So we're giving up, or we're Kinder Morgan is proposing that we give up our lands and we potentially put our beautiful marshlands and our rivers in danger so that they can potentially export it. I mean, that's private company greed. That has nothing to do with Georgia's public need. That has nothing to do with protecting and saving our waterways. If this was something that we need, if anyone here had ever experienced a fossil fuel shortage on the coast, that might be something worth talking about, but there is no need there. The only need that Alan Four even mentioned from Kinder Morgan was the need to supply the suppliers that are already willing to purchase the product, and that's not here in Georgia.
America is now a global leader when it comes to taking serious action to fight climate change. And frankly, approving this project would have undercut that global leadership. And that's the biggest risk we face. Not acting. Today, we're continuing to lead by example. Because ultimately, if we're going to prevent large parts of this earth from becoming not only inhospitable, but uninhabitable in our lifetimes, we're going to have to keep some fossil fuels in the ground rather than burn them and release more dangerous pollution into the sky.
So how can we take away something that Georgians have protected for their family and their family's future and their history and just let it be taken up by an energy company who's going to give us nothing in return?
And, you know, I understand that they're probably not maliciously doing anything to harm people or property, but the facts are that it's simply too dangerous to do. And the state of Georgia and the citizens have spoken, and we don't need it and we don't want it.
They act like we don't speak. That's the top of our river. We're in the middle. We're at the bottom. That's when they seem to work in this disjointed nature, right? So we'll just cut. Is the death of 1,000 cuts? Well, I hate to tell you, you're in a place where we actually talk. That's South Carolina. This is Georgia. We're together.